Good. Thank you, Mark. So I'm going to make a brief introduction to the award, the Hooey Award for Excellence in Graduate Research and Service. And it's a pleasure to do this with Professor Paulette Clancy, who is an emeritus member of our department and the director of chemical and biomolecular engineering at Johns Hopkins. But as director, as my director and the department's director, just over a decade ago here at Cornell, she established this award to be the highest honor for our graduate students. That was actually a collaboration with then DGS Lyndon Archer. And quickly after it being established, it became really the all-around award for excellence of our graduate students, recognizing both research excellence and service excellence. And that is a dual challenge for the awardees, and that's taken very seriously. And I'll just say in general, this is a process where nominees are nominated by faculty and then considered by a panel of graduate student leaders from AICHE. And as I've observed it, it's an extremely rigorous process. Just to give a sense, when there isn't an appropriate candidate, the award is not given. And that is the sign of a very a prestigious honor, not something that you usually see. I've heard that the Landau Award in physics in Russia is a place where if there's not an appropriate candidate, they just don't give it one year. But you'll note the Nobel Prize always gives an award. So the Hooey honor is truly an honor, and this year it's a pleasure to have Abhishek and Andrew as the awardees. And as Paulette pointed out, she has been the founder and champion of this award with more awardees than anyone, and she still thinks she can have a few more in the coming semesters. We'll see if that's true. But congratulations, Abhishek and Andrew, and I look forward to your talk. And I will turn it over to the faculty advisor to introduce the speakers. Fernando.
Thank you, Abe. So I'm delighted to introduce Abhishek Sharma, who probably needs no introduction to most graduate students in the department, given his extensive involvement with all kinds of activities in the past years, from the women's group to DIP to the CBE podcast team. So in case you know, Abhishek came to Cornell in 2016 after graduating from IIT Delhi, where he conducted extensive research for his honor thesis that was titled Self-Interaction of Proteins in Dispersions, which led to several publications, in fact. But now this was 100% experimental work. And when he came to see me about possibly joining my group, well, there was no doubt that he was talented, but it was unclear if he was a good fit to our work that was 100% simulation. Furthermore, we were no longer studying protein binding interactions, which may have been what brought him to my door in the first place. But from those early interactions, what made an impression in me was that he had an exuberant curiosity and enthusiasm. And for those of us who have been in this business for a long time, like myself, we know how crucial those qualities are. An advisor can help creating some of the sparks, but the fire, the fuel for research must come from within the student. And Abhishek had plenty of that. So since then, and despite Abhishek's initial inexperience with those tools in my group, it's been a pleasure to work with him. It's been like a journey, seeing at times things anew through his fresh eyes. And as it happens with the best students, I just needed to stay out of his way. I did take advantage of his talents and can-do attitude to give him very hard problems to work on, some of which had been puzzling some of us for a while, mostly related to understanding entropic forces as they drive a structural order or self-assembling nanoparticles in polymeric systems. And he did this while creating new methods to study them. So his work falls in the context of nucleation phenomena, which, as you know, is ever present in all sorts of phase transitions. You may not get a full sense of his work in this short presentation, but I hope you will share his sense of wonder as he grew as a researcher and citizen, and even see that he did so while having a lot of fun. Abhishek, his wit, good humor, and unfailing enthusiasm have been a blessing not only for CBE as a whole, but especially to my group members, perhaps especially during these last months of social distancing. Like a poet who sees rhymes where others only see words scrambling, Abhishek has seen order where others only saw nothing. Abhishek, please.
Thank you, Fernando, for that kind introduction. I mean, um, you should thank Abe for actually deflecting me off his group um, and telling me that I am a theorist at heart. All right. Can you guys see my screen and my laser pointer? Wanted to
Yes.
go. All right. So, yeah, I would like to thank Fernando and thank the committee for choosing me alongside Andrew. I mean, Fernando, you probably forgot the haiku that you were supposed to put in, but I have one. Never mind. My haiku is hiding in plain sight. It's titled Into the Unknown, Simulations of Self-Assembly and Service to the CBE. When I was first asked to give this talk, I took a step back to find what is the connective tissue between the two things, simulations and the service. And by the end of this, I hope I can share what I found and maybe you find something important out of it. Let me start with Ervin Schrodinger, Nobel laureate in physics, inventor of Schrodinger's equation, Schrodinger's cat, yada yada. But in his book, What is Life, he admittedly embarked on something scandalous. Right at the preface, he began, a scientist is supposed to have a complete and thorough knowledge at first hand of some subjects, and therefore is not usually expected therefore is usually expected not to write on any topic of which he is not a life master. This is regarded as a matter of noblesse oblige. For the present purpose, I beg to renounce the noblesse, if any, and to be freed of any ensuing obligation. In this book, he addresses topics well beyond his area of mastery, going into genetics and origins of living systems, and makes rather good predictions on what might constitute to be a hereditary molecule, and why are living beings much larger than their constituent atoms, all using statistical mechanics based arguments. I think this renouncement of noblesse leading to new science illustrates that doing things that you have never done before can yield good results. This sentiment resonates with me personally, and I find this to be the connecting theme of my research and service. This might sound like one of those platitudes people say at commencement addresses, but much like those statements, with enough nuance, they do capture certain truths and wisdom. So let me add some nuance here. First, with my research scholarship. My current research, as Fernando mentioned, deals with simulations rooted in statistical thermodynamics. When I first stepped inside Olin in 2016, I did not have any experience with simulations or statistical thermodynamics. In fact, here is my undergrad transcript. I had a C grade in classical thermodynamics. Yet, right before coming to grad school, I had read the aforementioned book by Schrodinger and was deeply curious about this area of physics called statistical mechanics that deals with how haphazard behavior of a large collection of atoms can lead to average properties at a macroscopic level. Then it was Fernando's class that fully convinced me that instead of going after my undergrad specialization in biochemical engineering, I should give statistical thermodynamics a try. As an undergraduate who entirely performed bio-related experiments, I really came into simulations and modeling as an outsider. Often I have heard experimentalist colleagues act skeptical about simulation and theory. I've heard all sorts of things over the years. Are these things even real? I was once asked in deadpan. I understand that sentiment personally, and I would believe it probably 5 years ago, because many of us do require tangible systems to have a sense of accomplishment about scientific discovery. But when it comes to physical systems, not all can be explained through direct observation. Features could be too small. Events could take place too fast for us to directly observe them. And here is where I believe the ability to model becomes useful. As you may have heard, mathematics is the language of the universe. Once you have a model that is a good description of your system, even as you may not be able to exactly solve it with pen and paper or with your brain if you are smart, the simulations give you a godlike omniscience about the system. You know where every single molecule is, and events that would happen in nanoseconds could be watched in super slow motion. The core task of the simulator then is to distill this knowledge to aid development of theory and inform experiments. In fancy philosophical terms, simulations are epistemological telescopes. That is, they help us achieve knowledge well beyond our immediate reach. So, with this perspective, I would think that this is the banner under which my work can be categorized, where I have simulated nanoscale systems and leveraged this omniscience about systems to decipher complex mechanisms that are hard to describe without that kind of knowledge. I've worked on a variety of projects, as you can see on this slide. I've worked on nanoparticles, simulation methods, and even chemically amplified photoresists. But today I'm going to solely focus on the nanoparticle side of things. So why are we interested in nanoparticles? Well, much like how a single water molecule leads to emergence of an intricate snowflake, we are interested in how a nanoparticle's shape can influence the assembly of a large number of such particles in a colloidal solution. This is particularly motivated by the recent advances in our ability to synthesize particles of exquisite shapes. We study this through hard particle Monte Carlo simulations, where there is only one rule to the interaction, that the particles shall not overlap. This abstraction allows us to study the entropic effects born out of particle shape decoupled from the enthalpic effects arising from forces between the particles. The enthalpic effects are also important and are being studied by other students, but in this project, I focus on entropic effects as they are always present in the background and are themselves very complex. In 1950s, when we first caught hold of computers to do simulations, one of the very first predictions was that hard spheres, when compressed enough, would spontaneously assemble into closed packed lattices that are ordered. And more recently, similar simulations of faceted particles have shown formation of crystals with interesting properties. Here I'm showing you the case for Octahedra. If you play Dungeons and Dragons like I do, these are your D8s. They form this interesting lattice with voids. Hard cubes, on the other hand, form this nearly space-filling lattice. Much of my work has to do with how these phase transitions take place. And as Fernando mentioned, they usually take place through nucleation and growth. And most systems are very well described by classical nucleation theory. A more or less spherical nucleus of a stable phase embedded in the metastable phase has a free energy that is described by a bulk term and a surface term. The surface term dominates for small nuclei, and the bulk term eventually overcomes, leading to a free energy barrier, which is directly related to the nucleation rate. I've calculated these free energy barriers for several shapes using well-known techniques such as umbrella sampling, and even developing a technique of my own. Once all is found, we observe that faceting can influence the barrier heights in interesting ways. At the same driving force, the certain shapes like octahedra are harder to nucleate than spheres, while others find it easier to nucleate and have a lower nucleation barrier, like truncated octahedra. These trends can be partially attributed to the level of facet alignment between the particles intrinsic to the growing crystal lattice. In case of truncated octahedra, you find that in the crystal, each particle is aligning its facets with its neighbors. And such motifs are favored in the disordered phase due to entropic effects similar to depletion forces. On the other hand, for octahedra, the prominent configuration leads to a suboptimal facet alignment when compared to a configuration where facets are matched completely. There are also deviations from the norm of nucleation and growth with a spherical nucleus. And here is an example of just that, with a shape called gyrobifastigium, in short GBF. If you start with a spherical seed, it quickly grows into a prolate geometry. This geometry persists for much larger nucleus sizes. Using a method I have developed, you can find the geometry of the nucleus starting from an arbitrary shape. So you start with a spherical nucleus. Through the course of the simulations, the simulation will reveal the natural shape that the nucleus would take. Recently, we have been able to understand better why this shape is formed through the measurement of interfacial free energies of various crystal planes. And then we used Wolf construction to confirm the nucleus shape as well. Besides this, there are other examples of deviation from the norm, which I must omit for the sake of brevity. I hope to elaborate on my research at future opportunities, including the CBE symposium and my impending thesis defense. But I would not be able to do simulations today if it was not for Fernando. It has always been a joy to work with him, and I've looked forward to each and every day. Unfortunately, I've come to understand that my experience is quite idiosyncratic and not shared by many graduate students who time and again find themselves at odds with their advisor's expectations and goals. I firmly believe that grad school is not supposed to be a harsh experience for anyone and should be a place of growth. I think Fernando is doing many things right when it comes to advising. So here are a few features that I really think facilitated my growth as a researcher that were there in his advising. The most important thing I find is that I have never been afraid of sharing difficulties I've faced, never been afraid of being judged for showing weakness, be it scholarly, physiological, or mental. I've never had to power through a sick day or mood swings and cloak everything under the veil of productivity. This has created a stimulating environment where I can openly work on my mistakes instead of hiding them. Fernando also cares to learn who I am as a person, other than a researcher. In contrast, I have heard advisors dissuading their students from pursuing service. I think without his advising, I would not be where I am today. So thank you, Fernando. Now, let me segue into my journey as a department citizen. When I was a first year, I did not have a clear idea of what extracurricular initiatives could do for me. I even saw them as wasteful, leisurely activities. This was very much a continuation of my behavior as an undergraduate, and I was laser focused on my studies and my research being the main and the only purpose of my time at Cornell. In addition, as an international student, cultural differences also made me hesitant to jump in and embarrass myself, acting awkward. I looked at Cornell as merely a stopover and not somewhere I should try to integrate myself. Excuse me. But now I think of this worldview, I find myself very narrow-minded. For now, I have the 2020 vision. I know the importance of learning from other individuals. I have learned so many new things that I did not think I needed to know. And most importantly, I have a better sense of service to the community. I've been fortunate to be able to contribute to a variety of initiatives within the department over the last few years. So how did I go from this state to the other? Well, you could think of this as a phase transition, perhaps. And here I needed the right conditions to climb the barrier, the most important being the individuals who I like to call the catalysts, who lowered the barrier for me. Fernando is a fine example of one. Each initiative I have participated in had several such catalysts that welcomed me into activities I had no clue about, didn't judge me when I failed, and taught me by example. I hope to present you a few examples where this was the case. In 2018, I remember Susan asked me one morning after the seminar that why am I not doing more with the department? Why don't I join with CBE Women? And at that point, my participation was minimal. And it turns out the position of webmaster was open. And even as I had no clue how to make a website, I thought I could use the opportunity to learn to make one. My 2 years at CBE Women was a lesson for me in how to run an organization efficiently and achieve ambitious goals. As for myself, during my tenure as a webmaster, I was able to create a whole new website from scratch, which basically brought us to the modern internet age and streamlined many organization processes. On my way out, I even helped implement ranked choice voting in our election, which is obviously the better way to do it, but I digress. Involvement in these initiatives really grows on you, and the next right thing to do was to work with just about every initiative in the department. I have worked with Science Blender for the last 2 years. I was interested in science communication when I came in, but I had no interest in podcasting. I even thought that it was a dead format given our short attention spans. Moreover, for a person like me, born with a stutter, people have always told you to not consider anything that needs speech control. But I wanted to see what the initiative was about, and the people in the team led by Joey and Kevin were quite driven. Turns out it is quite difficult to communicate science, and producing a podcast has its own learning curve. But I was guided well through the process, and the satisfaction of creating a well done episode is totally worth it. I was fortunate to be able to tell 3 interesting stories of graduate students in our department: Arna, Laura, Dave, all international students, by the way. Just as a sneak peek, here is a clip from Dave's episode where I talk about what his story has, has to teach to us. Dave's story shows us how science is deeply intertwined with our humanity, how it is often born out of practical needs in the times of crisis, just like the one we are in right now during COVID-19 pandemic. In order to solve grand challenges, we need science, but we also need the human spirit to identify the problems in our community, to seek the solutions to these challenges, and above all, to persevere along the way. Individuals like Dave embody that human spirit. This story should leave us all asking ourselves, what are the problems that my community is facing today? And what can I do to help solve them?
Thanks for listening. And a big thank you to Dave for sharing his story with us. We wish him the best in his future endeavors.
That was Alicia Aquino from the Lisa Group. She's a co-producer on this episode and a fantastic person to work with. Please give our stories a listen. If you haven't, you will not regret it. I've learned a lot through these stories and others at Science Blender, and I hope they inspire others too. If you're interested in joining, we are always looking for more people. So feel free to contact Mark Googe, who is also on this call. And there were many more experiences like these. I remember in early 2018, Lakshmi Nathan from Daniel Group reached out to me for being a part of the nascent alumni reunion committee. I still do not know what she saw in me, but it was my first taste contributing to a team of students. Andrew, the other awardee today, brought me on board with both CheckSci and CBE Symposium, and I was very reluctant to join either. But as I know now, both were excellent experiences which integrated me well with the community. My skills as a podcast producer also came in handy when Fernando, Natalia, and Karthik wanted to run the Scholarship of Fellowship event for the DIP. I've been part of both renditions of the event, and I think it has brought out some very exciting anecdotes to the community. The bottom line is that it needed these people to create a welcoming environment for me to thrive and do things I had never done before. In my experience, it does not take much to be a catalyst. A few words of encouragement might do the trick. You never know when your peers or mentees might just need that final push to do something great. Go out there and be a catalyst for someone. I hope to take these lessons with me for the future to do things I have never done before, be it science or service at large. I would like to end this talk by saying that all these years, there were people who judged me for being different, for thinking differently, for doing the right thing, and even for being sincere. And perhaps this has made me doubt myself at times as well. I wondered, what if I become a failure doing things outside my comfort zone? What would I have done if I had failed? I guess we will never know. So I hope you found this talk interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abhishek. That was great. Really, absolutely great. So we have, and I'm looking at timing. We have about a minute or so for Q&A. So let's do 2 quick questions, and then if there are other questions, then hopefully we will find some time after the second talk. Any questions for Abhishek?
So can I say one thing very quickly? So first, just thanks, Abhishek, for your kind words towards me. And so I didn't really forget your haiku, but I thought that you would like that little poem I said at the end of my introduction. If you didn't like it, so this is the haiku that I presented. It says, to solve a puzzle, like microscope his mind, hidden patterns finds. So anyways, I like the poem a little better, but it's for you.
Thank you, Fernando.
You're welcome.
That's great. Thank you. Any other questions for Abhishek before we turn things over to Paulette and Andrew? If not, then I think maybe after the end of Abhishek's talk, we'll set some time for further Q&A, because I thought there was a lot of really interesting things here. I really appreciated your description of the 2016 and 2020 mindset in context of the activation energy in a catalysis. I thought that was a wonderful example. So with that, and mindful of timing, let's turn things over to Paulette, who's going to introduce Andrew Ruttinger.
Thank you, Tobias.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's really delightful to be back home. For those of you who don't know me, I left Cornell as the Samuel and Diane Bodman Chair Emerita of Chemical Engineering, and it's wonderful to be with you all today. I want to say congratulations to Abhishek, who fittingly I last worked with on a service project, which was the Alumni Association, and to Andrew, and to say 2 things that they have in common. One, they're both international students, which talks to the strength that there is in a program through the international students. And secondly, of course, that they're both computational, and we all know that computation is on an incredible roll at the moment for showing its worth and its relevance to modern problems. I want to give a couple of background remarks on the Hooey Award, a little bit because they relate to the speakers and also to the kind of life lessons that Abhishek was talking about. So this legacy came about through William Hooey, who was Austin Hooey's father. And William was, his family were immigrants from Ireland in the Great Famine. He got a degree in chemistry despite this sort of slow start in about 1905 and at Cornell, and he became a salesman of chemical supplies. And of course, this took him around the country, and he liked the look of a little startup. And when they went public, he bought a lot of stock, and that company was Procter & Gamble. So he knew how to pick good stocks. And that was passed on to his daughter, Austin Hooey, who is not an engineer, but she was a pathfinder for women. She actually went into finance, perhaps based on her father's great eye for a good stock. She made a lot of money by investing. She also bucked the trends for women at the time by not marrying, not having children. Instead, work was important to her, but so were her pets. And when in her estate, she decided to reward both of those. So she endowed the dean of the vet school at Cornell, and she also endowed the chair of the chemical engineering department because it was closest, she felt, to what her father would have liked to have been if a chemical engineering department existed at that time. So it's great that we have somebody who wasn't a rule follower, who kind of bucked the trends and was doing something new in this award, which is all about rewarding something that's new. And so in this regard, it's great for me to have the honor to introduce Andrew Ruttinger. He's a proud Canadian by birth and by education. He got his degree at the University of Western Ontario in chemical engineering. He came to Cornell with an NSERC fellowship. And honestly, everything that he touched in research has turned to gold, including, and here's a life lesson for you, including a project with Jeff Tester that I told him not to get involved with, because I said it's a morass and you'll get stuck in it and nothing will come of it. But he spun that too into gold with Anna, who Abhishek mentioned. So Andrew has been incredibly prolific. He has 3 first author papers already published. He has a Nature Energy paper under revision. And he will have at least 2 papers, probably 2 papers on his phase change materials, and another one that he's writing on best practices for a computational technique called nudged elastic bands, which deals with energy barriers. But I also want to talk about his contributions to service, because it really has been perhaps the defining characteristic about Andrew, besides his prowess in research. And that is his commitment really throughout his PhD to service. He was, I believe, the first person to be the CHEGSA president for 2 terms. He certainly created a strong effort to diversify representation on the board, increasing both the number of women and the number of international students. And my favorite aspect of his CHEGSA work was that he changed the Thanksgiving meal from a traditional American meal to a potluck, a cultural potluck, where students brought food and drinks from their hometowns and countries. In fact, I remember an epic cooking session in the tiny little kitchenette in Olin Hall to try and make food there, which was incredibly difficult. That year, there were 14 countries represented. And I think it's such a wonderful story to recognize the value of international students and their place here, that I've taken that wonderful example to heart at Hopkins. And the first year that I went there, I initiated Andrew's idea to make an international potluck for Thanksgiving. He's also worked with postdocs to make that a better community. He's worked with Habitat for Humanity. He did a lot to foster the development, I think at a pivotal time in its development for the GSA. But I really want to end by talking about his volunteering to advance Canadian energy policy. My understanding of how important energy policy was to Andrew came about because of actually the grad school survey, where every year you all talk about your hopes and your accomplishments and the things you're struggling with. And I learned about that at first through that venue, which was kind of interesting. So I encourage that because I see in Andrew a future leader. In fact, I've said to him that I can well imagine him becoming the Secretary of Energy for Canada in the future. And he's done an awful lot. He's working with the Canadian Science Policy Centre. He has been the creator of a survey of parliamentarians to talk about energy policy. He has made presentations. He's been featured in a Canadian Science Policy magazine as a lead author of his work in that regard. And he's really taking those ideas, his passion for policy for renewable energy, and he's making a coherent bid to transition to perhaps a non-traditional role for a chemical engineer, just in the same way that Austin Hooey had a non-traditional path. He's a great team player. He's probably the most respected senior member of my research group for his consensus building and his team playing. He supervised undergraduates and graduate students. I think that Andrew, if he had chosen, could be anything, I certainly would have supported him enthusiastically to be a faculty member. But I'm really thrilled to see him take his passion for service to the next level and to get involved with the Canadian government. So it's a great honor to be able to thank Andrew for his wonderful contributions to the Cornell and Hopkins departments of chemical engineering, and also to wish him all the best in the future. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen and my laser pointer. So thank you, Paulette, for the very kind introduction. Of course, that was wonderful, and feel pretty honored to be able to go after Abhishek too. I know he always gives a good presentation, so I'm excited to give mine as well. So I'm trying to kind of approach this from a different way than a technical talk, I think similar to how Abhishek did. And I kind of tried to explore different roles that I played throughout my PhD. So outside of just kind of the typical research scientist role. And what I wanted to do here is kind of present that as more of a thought-provoking framework, not necessarily a guideline, because of course, I think everyone kind of has their own path as a scientist. So what I hope is to present my path and how that relates to what I'm most passionate about, which is climate action. And hopefully people can kind of think about this and think about ways maybe they can apply that to the things they're most passionate about. So to begin, I think most of us, there's no secret that CO2 emissions are leading to rising global temperatures. And I think that's really the main framework for something like the Paris Agreement, which is a global agreement to reduce these emissions. But there's a lot of other indirect effects that I think people are also aware of too, such as you have melting glaciers, extreme weather conditions like wildfires that you see in Western United States or Australia. You have rising sea levels, which are putting cities like Venice at risk of being underwater, habitat loss, climate refugees, and ocean acidification. So, I mean, I can keep listing these. There's a lot of big challenges. And I think for scientists, this is something that we really need to work together on. From a more quantitative point of view, because I think that's how scientists like us like to look at this. If we look at things like atmospheric CO2, we can see that in order to mitigate our warming, we need to stay below these two thresholds, which you see here. And you can see that our trajectory is kind of putting us well on track to surpass that unless we change our consumption in the next decade or so. The thing that really makes this difficult is that when you look at our primary energy demand, it's actually supposed to increase through 2040. And right now we have about 85% of our energy coming from fossil fuels, despite the fact that renewable energy is actually the fastest growing sector. When you break that down, we actually still have a net increase of fossil fuel energy. So really what we're trying to do is balance these basically differing trajectories and find a way to both have more energy, renewable energy, and also reduce emissions at the same time. And the International Energy Agency actually kind of sums this up nicely in their last report. But to reach net zero emissions, we need governments, energy companies, investors, and citizens to all be on board. And we all, I think, need to make really unprecedented contributions. So this really made me think about my role that I play. So like I said, I think as scientists, we all focus on research. But I wanted to explore maybe different ways that I could create an impact in this area too. And so this is me. And these are the 4 roles that I felt like I've played through my PhD. So of course, being a pioneer, again, that's our classic scientist kind of like role that we play. But I also tried to be an intermediary between scientists and decision makers. I tried to be ambassador of the scientific community, and I also tried to be a community builder within that. So I hope to touch upon these as we go forward. And again, just try to create a thought-provoking framework for everyone. So if we're looking at this from a pioneering point of view, I guess the best way to reduce emissions is to figure out where emissions are most common. So this is a sectoral breakdown from the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. And it's showing that different major sectors that are emitters globally. So we can see that number one of theirs, a quarter of our production is electricity and heat production. So what I tried to do in the last, I guess, year and a half or so was I tried to approach this from an energy storage point of view. So this is just a curve of basically our typical energy demand throughout the day. So you can see that it tends to peak in the evening, usually when people get home from work, and it tends to be lower during the day and of course at night. And for many of us, we know that this is where the big issue in renewable energy lies, because when you look at something like solar, of course, it tends to peak in midday when the sun's up. And of course, you can see from this that these definitely don't overlap, and you actually have a little bit of a gap between the two. So this is really the main driver for energy storage, and there's a ton of work on batteries. I'm not a battery person, but of course, that's a huge area, and I think that needs to be addressed. What I try to focus this on is actually from something that might not be as mature, but I also think has huge potential too, and that's actually thermal energy storage. And Cornell actually has a system that's in place for this already. So they actually pump up lake water during the summer and use this to cool buildings. So that's an example of some type of thermal energy storage where your lake is essentially that cold reservoir. The issue with this is it's only sensible heat, so it doesn't have long-term storage potential. And what we want to look for is something that maybe can access on a scale of hours to days. So what I started investigating was they're called phase change materials, and essentially what they do is leverage basically an energy dense chemical phase change to capture that latent heat, and that allows you to kind of, like I said, go into that scale of hours to days, and that allows you to facilitate tackling this challenge of renewable energy storage. So I won't go into too much detail, but I do computational modeling of this method called layer by layer assembly, which essentially you just create an oil and water emulsion using surfactants of a particular surface charge. And then you basically self-assemble charged polymers called polyelectrolytes onto the surface to encapsulate it. And then that stabilizes your phase change material and allows it to be used for repeated use, hopefully on the scale of, we'll say like 10 years, 20 years. Of course, it's still nascent at this point. What I'm trying to do, of course, is to find this relationship between these two materials, polyelectrolytes and surfactants, and basically the optimal properties for these capsule materials to hopefully be able to kind of create a predictive toolbox in a way. I think that's something that computationalists like to do. And hopefully experimentalists like to, will trust our work and kind of take that. So this is kind of what I'm looking at for my simulation. So it's just a quick video, but what you see at the top is basically the interface where I'm trying to deposit these polyelectrolytes, which you're seeing below those long molecules. And I'm not showing the solvents because of course you wouldn't be able to see much. And then the phase change material would be at the top here. Yeah, so it moves pretty quickly, but it's pretty cool because you can clearly see that the molecules kind of start to self-assemble. And from that, what I was able to was actually look at dynamical properties or structural properties for this. And from there, again, the goal was to kind of try to predict maybe if there's something quantifiable, some metric that's quantifiable that we can use to kind of rank different systems. So that's exactly what I did. And this is just a quick example showing something that I would do. Basically, you have this surfactant polyelectrolyte system. And you would have some observable that you're looking for, say fast deposition time, which of course lowers the synthesis time and makes productivity on an industrial scale a little better. And you can try to relate that to simple things, again, like interaction energies between the surfactant and the polyelectrolyte, or interaction energy between the polyelectrolyte and the solvent. And what we actually found is that there's a correlation between deposition time and weaker polyelectrolyte solvent energy. And this is probably fairly intuitive, but I think it's really a quick and elegant way to kind of show how we can really vet these and then hopefully be able to be more predictive and strategic about how we design these materials going forward. So I think that's probably the most technical part of the talk. It'll get a little technical after that. And now moving on to what I was talking about being an intermediary between scientists and decision makers. So this is what I really got interested in, I would say, in the last couple of years. And I think decision makers tend to speak a different language than scientists. I think that's a big challenge that a lot of scientists actually deal with, is trying to figure out how to communicate ideas. I mean, we see this a ton during this pandemic where I think a lot of people are trying to say, listen to the experts. And of course, there's been pushback from different parties. So I think the challenge for us is really figuring out how can we speak in a language that decision makers respond to. And so one way that I like to tackle this is actually using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a framework. So what this is, it's basically 17 goals. And the goal, of course, is to globally kind of equitably and sustainably develop our societies so that we can kind of grow technologically, but also have more responsible consumption. And if I were a politician looking at this, I think, unfortunately, you really have to have probably one of these. So either affordability or economic growth or innovation. I think from a re-election standpoint, I think economic growth tends to be kind of the focal point. So usually if you're trying to get a politician's attention, you might start with this. But then from that, you can kind of branch off into whatever you think you might like. So for me, of course, this talk's kind of centered around climate action, and that's how I try to kind of frame my research. So I add that in, and I also wanted to add in responsible consumption and production, because I think there's a lot of focus on circular economy from people that are focused on environmental protection. So taking these, I then wanted to kind of add this into my research, and to kind of lay the foundation for that and the economic side of this and the innovation side of this. I'm going to present what's called carbon lock-in. So essentially, this is a form of technological lock-in, and the idea for this is that the incumbent system has some type of inertia associated, which makes it difficult to substitute. And so what carbon lock-in is essentially that, except for fossil fuel energy systems, where you see that if you have a coal power plant that's in place, it's quite difficult to remove because of the financial barriers and other barriers associated with that. So there's really two mechanisms that we need to overcome to be able to basically substitute this. So the first is technological push. And that idea is that you basically need to get the other technology up to a point where it can do the work that this incumbent technology can do. And then the second is market pull. So there has to be some type of incentive from a market standpoint that makes it economically favorable to be able to replace this. And what this figure is showing here is the effective carbon price to be able to retire different systems early. So for example, coal power, you might need a carbon price of about $60 per ton of carbon dioxide. And that would provide the economic incentive necessary to retire this. One technology that's would be really benefit from this is carbon capture and utilization. And I'll add the storage component in there for this sake. Essentially what this is from the utilization standpoint is you capture carbon dioxide and you actually want to take that carbon from this and convert it into usable products that have more value, like bioproducts and biochemicals. And there's a lot of potential here. Like I said, if you look at this curve that I'm showing at the bottom here, there's basically projections that show if we meet the Paris Agreement, we can be storing over 10 gigatons of CO2 per year. We're a little bit below that curve as of last year. And so this is why I think technological push in this area and getting decision makers on board is very important for this technology. And again, if you're looking at kind of the broader emissions reduction targets, you can see that this would be targeting industry. And of course, it can also target electricity and heat production. I'm focused on the industry aspect, but there's a big chance to, again, reduce emissions. And so this is my process that I'm looking at, essentially capturing carbon dioxide using renewable electricity and converting it into something that's higher value via this kind of stepwise procedure. But I think as chemical engineers, we all realize that this isn't actually what a system would look at. So I'll present what it's quite difficult to see. It's a little small, but basically this is showing the complexity of the process that I'm actually looking at. Maybe this might stress some people out because they remember their capstone design processes. But again, there's quite a lot of components that went into this. And so what I did was I created a mass and energy balance of this process. And then to tie this back into that intermediate stage, what I wanted to do after was basically assess the economics of this and see if there's any policies that are in place that could kind of push this over the edge. So what I'm showing here is this is net present value. Again, this is just a way to kind of look at the economics of this process. And the green is showing the more green, the more profitable it is. And I looked at basically 3 different properties that were cost drivers. So carbon price, electricity price, and actually the methanol separation through distillation was quite energy intensive. And then by playing around with these variables, we can find scenarios that were economically favorable, especially from a carbon price point of view, because I think that's something that's on the agendas of a lot of governments. And so if you use an example, like say you get your methanol separation cost down to 50% of maybe its baseline, you would only need carbon price of $34 per ton of CO2, which some countries are actually able to meet that. And that is a reasonable target, I think, going forward for countries that don't have one in place to kind of go forward with. So taking this, then we can kind of do a parametric analysis and look at different ways we can kind of incentivize or create an environment for different countries to basically get this kind of nascent technology off the ground. So I looked at 3 different things: carbon price, like I was just describing, but we also need an investment framework that kind of enables this technology to grow. So I looked at research, development, and demonstration investment from governments too. And then I also looked at infrastructure access. And what I mean by that is basically how much renewable energy they had through their grid. So the darker the circle, the less. And what I actually found was that there's not a lot of agreement or correlation between carbon price and this investment framework that we're seeing here. It's kind of a 1/x shape. And so what this is kind of signifying is that I think globally we kind of need more coordination in this strategy. And I think that's a good recommendation for decision makers to kind of coordinate this, because you do need both that technological push and that market pull to get these things onto market. I think Norway is actually probably the best example of this, where they kind of have that balanced both. And then if we look at just going back to my carbon price thing, so if we use that baseline of $34 per ton of CO2, and we look at this globally, we can actually see that there's 6 countries that do meet that target right now, but I think we're pretty far behind in a lot of cases. So I think globally, what we should strive for is higher carbon prices that do incentivize this type of technology. The US, of course, doesn't federally have a carbon price. It does have a tax incentive, which is good. And there are states that also have carbon prices, like California, which I think renewables in this kind of environmentally sustainable energy tends to be quite popular there. So again, yeah, just using policy and describing our research and policy terms like this, I think is a good way to kind of get decision makers to kind of get behind our work a bit more. So I'll try to move forward through these next ones a little quickly because we're running low on time. So next, talking about being an ambassador, and of course, why it's important. Well, if we look at these statistics, 74% of Americans are cautious of global warming, which is good. But on the other hand, that also means that there's a quarter that aren't. And this is a trend across the world as well, what you're seeing. This is from the New York Times. So this is quite interesting because when you look at data, I mean, we're incredibly accurate at predicting this global rise of temperature. And as it relates to CO2 emissions, we also know that about a large portion of this of our impact actually creates more severe weather. So 70% is more severe because of us. And in the US, there's actually, those blue areas are at risk of being climate migrants because of these different changes in weather, because of CO2 emissions. And those red areas are actually probably where those people would end up, and it would create a strain on that economy and infrastructure. So we need to, again, this is something why we need, I think, everyone to kind of be on board with this climate action. But this leads to the question, well, why isn't everyone? And a lot of that has to do actually with misinformation and disinformation. And I think this figure kind of shows a nice way to describe what this is. So misinformation just tends to be, it doesn't tend to necessarily be deceitful, but it is misleading. And it often gets propagated without people realizing that it's misleading. And that's actually a very big challenge for scientists to kind of get past that. Whereas disinformation actually does tend to be deceitful and misleading as well. And a lot of times that's actually tends to be funded by actors that have particular interests. So what I'm showing here is that oil firms actually tend to spend a lot of money in lobbying against the effects of climate change. And what I'm showing in the bottom left here is essentially just your feedback loop, where you have these actors kind of feeding in this false information that gets caught on by maybe a politician or a decision maker, and then it kind of has some feedback and echo chamber. And so as scientists, what we can do is what I highlighted at the top here with the stars. So preemptively providing correct information, I think, is one thing. And then responding to misinformation with facts is another thing that I think scientists do very well. So this leads into my service. In two ways I kind of try to tackle this, and this isn't necessarily related to climate action, but I do think it does share those characteristics. So again, I had the opportunity to be a program coordinator at the Ithaca Science Center. And this is, again, being kind of preemptive. So what we were trying to do is educate students about computer programming. And I think that education part is key because you're trying to preemptively get ahead of this misinformation so that when people are confronted with it, they are aware that it is misinformation and kind of can say, no, this is incorrect. So that's the one side. And the other is through my service at the Canadian Science Policy Center. That, of course, we're just trying to provide an open forum for providing facts. We did this specifically for the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, there's a ton of misinformation around that. And what we try to do is basically just solicit experts from both the scientific and the policy communities who can provide their input and then open this to the public so they can and produce a magazine where they can see these honest information and this honest perspective so that we can kind of combat this going forward. And then, so lastly, community builders. So again, this might be the one that's least connected to climate action, but I actually do feel that it is very important. And the reason why is actually because of, I think, the health and wellness side of this. So I think it's no secret that graduate students and academics are disproportionately affected by mental health. And if you look at some of these statistics, it's actually pretty crazy because 24% have reported stress negatively affecting their academics. And from a climate action point, what this means is that there's a quarter of students who aren't effectively able to maybe push towards climate action because their mental well-being isn't where it should be. And then you look at something like 2/3 of students have reported feeling overwhelming anxiety. These things have all got worse during the COVID-19 pandemic too. And what I tried to do for my service and my community building was provide that balance, which is this, I took this from Cornell Health, but that basically that balanced stress level. So that people could perform at their best and also be able to kind of be relaxed in an environment where they feel comfortable and able to kind of achieve their full potential. And so this is through my time at CHEGSA. And within the department, I really tried to promote this fellowship and this participation with everyone through different social events and professional development events. So like the traditional annual things, like Thanksgiving potluck and Halloween mixer. The international potluck actually wasn't. I didn't replace the Thanksgiving potluck, but we did that in May. And that was just to kind of bring to light people's different cultures. So what I'm showing here is this was a map where students were able to check off where they're from, and you could just see how global our department was, it's really cool. And again, it just really adds to, I think, our overall experience for everyone. And then of course, professional development, like our symposium and different workshops. So I'll end it there. But of course, I want to thank everyone who's helped me along the way from the research side. Paulette, of course, my advisor, but my collaborators. I know Chris Alavi was here. Jeff is not here, but I had the opportunity to collaborate with him. And of course, he's my committee member as well. The staff within CBE, I think they probably won't see this either, but I think it's important to recognize all that they do for us, especially from a CHEGSA standpoint. And then of course, some of the faculty who served with CHEGSA during my time here. So with that, I'll end. And thank you again for listening to me talk.